Well, thanks everyone. It's been a long day. I think you must be tired, but you have already sampled what Neil can do and energy that he dispels. I just want to say that it's a great pleasure to have him here at the AA. I think it's the first time. And it's great to have him. Obviously, we always are happy as well to welcome Stuart Elden back at the AA. He's been here, his lecture 3 years ago, I think. But it's just before I introduce them, I don't know, I think it's probably, I don't know if a statement to finish a sort of design symposium with theorists. And I think it's, to me, it's something quite important. I mean, a couple of days ago, there was a meeting here at the AA about the pedagogical model that we have to strive to. And one of the points that were made was this imbrication between design and histories and theories, which I think is, if not crucial, well, it's one of the most important things. No? Like we need to understand, we need to kind of get to grips to what's going on. No? We need to get the concepts and the frameworks by which we can operate. And I think this is a great opportunity to hear what Neil and Stuart has done in planetary urbanization and territory. So, well, Neil Brenner is a professor of urban theory at Harvard Graduate School of Design. His writing and teaching focus on the theoretical, conceptual, and methodological dimension of urban questions. His work builds upon and seeks to extend the fields of critical urban and regional studies, comparative geopolitical economy, and critical sociospatial theory. Major research focus include processes of urban and regional restructuring and uneven spatial development, planetary urbanization, cities and hinterlands in geohistorical and world ecological perspective, the problem of spatial visualization in urban studies, and processes of state spatial restructuring, with particular reference to the remaking of urban governance configurations under neoliberalizing capitalism. His most recent books are Implosions and Explosions, towards a study of planetary urbanization, and a critique of urbanization, selected essays. There's an upcoming book that perhaps he's also want to mention afterwards. And also we have Stuart Elden, is professor of political theory and geography at the University of Warwick, UK, and Monash Warwick professor at Monash University, Australia. He's author of books on territory, Michel Foucault, Martin Heidegger, and Henri Lefebvre. Shakespearean Territories will be published by University of Chicago Press imminently, and his studies of George Winghill, all right, okay, maybe you can help me with that afterwards, by Polity in early 2019. He has been involved in editing several collections of Henri Lefebvre's writings and has co-edit or edit books on Kant, Foucault, and Sloterdijk. He's currently working on a study of the very early Foucault in the 1950s, culminating in the process of writing the history of madness. A longer-term project explores the concept of terrain as a way of thinking about the materiality of territory, which we are very interested to see what is the outcome. And well, no more delays. Welcome to Neil Brenner.
Thanks a lot. I just need a handheld mic because I can't really be tethered to the podium. It's not going to work.
There's a mic.
Is there a mic? Is that okay? I mean, I have a loud voice, but I think we're trying to record it, so. Well, I'll go ahead and start at the podium while we get the handheld. So, thank you so much for inviting me to the AA. It is indeed my first time here. The AA is legendary. I've been reading stuff and reading about stuff that's produced here for so long, so I'm super happy to be here. I've been told that as long as we finish at 11 o'clock tonight, we can talk for as long as we want. Just kidding. It's been a long day. I got here a little bit late because I just flew in this morning, but it's been incredible just to listen to the work that everyone is doing. And my main regret is really that we didn't have more time, particularly for the presentations by those of you who only had 10 minutes. I really wanted to hear more and to discuss more, but I just want to say by way of starting, it's been a very impressive set of conversations. I also really appreciate the opportunity to be on a panel with my good buddy, Stuart Elden. We've been in dialogue for, let's say, a very long time. We've both been doing this for a while, but we first worked together actually before we even met in person over 15 years ago. We wrote a little paper together, just a kind of dialogue began through our work, and we've been good friends and close collaborators ever since, but we haven't crossed paths in a while, actually. So it's fantastic to be up here with Stuart, and I'm looking forward to the exchange. And I also want to say, I've got several former students in the room, but I'm also very happy to be here with Nikos Katsikis. As he mentioned, he and I are kind of in an ongoing dialogue and collaboration about urban theory, and a lot of what I want to say, Nikos has actually already said. I'll probably say it in a different way, but it makes my task a little bit easier, and in a certain way, it's part of our ongoing dialogue and collaboration. And then one other thing by way of just preface or sort of introduction. So this is definitely going to be a presentation about matters of theory, but I believe, and this is hopefully something we can discuss more generally together, I view theory as a kind of perspective through which to politicize life. I'll just start with that. So in a certain way, even though it's going to be abstract and it's very much about how do we conceptualize certain issues, I view theory as a way to, precisely through the conceptualization and reconceptualization of issues that we really care about, to get pretty political. So whether I accomplish that in my 30 minutes will be up to, we'll see. But that's sort of a framing for what I'm trying to do, both in this presentation, but also for what I try to do in a lot of my work in dialogue with designers. So this is an event on design and the Earth system. Questions about the Capitalocene, the Anthropocene have been put forward, and those are very fundamental issues for all of us today in the world, whatever our professional or political orientation. There are many different ways into those questions. I don't think there's a singular epistemological or political framework through which to confront such questions, because they're just too complex. And also because they're political, it means we need some kind of epistemic pluralism. We need a variety of approaches to confront them. So that's also just by way of a starting point into this. My particular way into these questions is through thinking about urbanization. And it's one way in, and we'll see how far we can go with it. But the starting point in adopting, or let me back up. In adopting urbanization as a way into these questions, my starting point is actually the proposition that we need to almost completely rethink our whole approach to what urbanization is. So that with a lot of, one of the hallmarks of a critical approach to theory is the idea that theory is itself historically constituted in relationship to a constantly mutating world. And if you view theory in that particular perspective, it means you have to constantly reinvent your concepts. It's not just about forming a framework and then applying the framework mechanically. The world constantly mutates. Theory is always racing to catch up with a mutating world. And the hallmark of a critical approach to theory of almost anything is an attempt to be reflexive about the relationship between your theory and the world that you're trying to understand. And that's, once you say that, you're already in the realm of politics. So when we set up the Urban Theory Lab a couple years ago at the GSD, that was kind of the starting point, was that we're very interested in urbanization as a way into fundamental planetary transformations and all the contestation and structural violence associated with those transformations. And the inheritance of urban theory is quite relevant to that challenge, but at the same time, there are all kinds of ways in which the world is, has transformed such that we need to reinvent our approach to the urban. And that's what I've been trying to do in some of my work, my collaborations with Christian Schmidt, with Nikos Katsikis, and many other colleagues. So, and that's kind of what I want to summarize today, and hopefully it provokes a interesting conversation. So, the inheritance of urban theory, there are many different traditions, but if I may venture a possibly dangerous overgeneralization, but one that I'm prepared to defend. The sort of standard inherited conception of the urban is basically as a dot. It's a node, it's an agglomeration, it's a circle. The spatiality of that dot can be conceptualized in different ways. Sometimes it's many dots, and the dots are interlinked within a hierarchy or a system, but it's basically a dot. And the language we use to refer to that dot is the city. I'm gonna have more to say about the word the in a little while, which is why I put it in quotation marks. In contemporary global urban discourse, there are many different versions of that particular spatial ontology. There's a demographic one, which Nikos already mentioned, the idea that we've crossed a majority urban world threshold, a kind of population, 50% population threshold. Rem Koolhaas uses that, but I'm not picking on Rem, because pretty much everybody that wants to work on cities in the urban these days invokes the UN's putatively authoritative data that we live in a majority urban world, because as of 2007, more than 50% of the world's population now lives within cities. My friends and colleagues at the LSE, this very important book actually, uses that idea as the kind of branding device for the Cities Project. And it's basically a kind of hourglass model of the urban. There's a redistribution of the world's population from the rural to the urban. The spatial containers themselves don't change. It's just a redistribution of people from a relatively statically conceived rural part of the hourglass to an equally statically conceived urban part of the hourglass. Of course, the world's population is growing, so there are more sands in the hourglass now than there were 50 years ago, but basically the container is fixed. There's also, of course, an economic discourse of contemporary urbanization. Nikos also alluded to that. The importance of cities as command and control nodes in the global economy, the kind of world cities approach of John Friedman, from whom this image is drawn, or Saskia Sassen, or again, what Nikos also invoked, the idea that cities are kind of the clusters of technological innovation and GDP growth. That's where sort of all the value is produced. And there's also, I didn't put it up here, but there's also, of course, an ecological discourse, which really should be up here as well. The idea that cities are kind of at the front lines of confronting the effects of climate change and ecological crisis, but also increasingly the kind of eco-modernist framework that was invoked in one of the presentations, or maybe several this afternoon, that cities are the sites where collective responses to the crises of climate change can most effectively be mobilized. So in the general mainstream discourse, I mean, a lot more could be said about this, but I'm just trying to make a generalization. The city is kind of taken for granted as a self-evident empirical site. And then it's about speculating about what its broader economic, political, ecological significance is. But I want to argue that that's actually a deeply misleading way of conceiving the phenomenon and the processes associated with the phenomenon. For me, the city, and therefore the urban, it's a theoretical dispositif. It's not simply an empirical site, a self-evident cluster or condition, but it's actually an abstraction. So anytime we talk about the city or the urban, we're already in the realm of abstraction, and the challenge is to unpack what that abstraction refers to, both in theory and in practice. And it's an abstraction, to quote, well, to build upon a kind of Marxian concept, which is also very important for Henri Lefebvre. It's a concrete abstraction, because it's an abstraction that's embedded within ongoing socio-spatial processes and struggles. It's not just an abstraction in my mind or your mind, it's an abstraction that's embedded within ongoing socio-spatial transformations that are grasped, maybe in everyday life, maybe by institutions, maybe by theorists, as somehow connected to the city and the urban. So again, Lefebvre I find very helpful here. He doesn't have all the answers, but he's got the questions, a lot of the questions pretty well formulated. So this is from, I believe, The Survival of Capitalism. Stuart will know better than anyone. So, but we have it, it's also a chapter of an important essay that Stuart and I co-translated called Reflections on the Politics of Space, which is in our volumes that we edited and partially co-translated State Space World. So this is actually very relevant to a lot of the issues that we've been talking about in this conference today. Lefebvre says he's thinking about space and ideology, which is actually, I think, where critical design has to start, the relationship between space and ideology. If space has an air of neutrality and indifference, it's precisely because the space has already been occupied, already planned, already the focus of past strategies, of which we cannot always find the traces. And I think a lot of spatial ideologies have been under discussion in today's conference, and I would argue that the city and the urban are exactly examples of that kind of a deeply ideological terrain. Precisely when something seems completely self-evident, such that we don't even need to debate, or it seems like we don't even need to debate about what it means or what it refers to, ideology is very likely at work. I mean, for Althusser, one of the great theorists of ideology, it's the very notion of I, yourself as a subject. That's really the ideology for Althusser, and in a certain way in the worlds of design and architecture and urbanism, the city has the same status. It's like so self-evident, the same way that when we say I, we just take that for granted as a coherent self, subject, that you don't even need to understand its constitution as such. The city is kind of a similar sort of thing. It's almost become the ideology of modern spatial discourse. But it's an ideology in the sense that we have to unpack what's actually going on and what is hidden, what is rendered invisible, even though it may be quite operative, when we talk about the city. So here's a few things that are going on, I hypothesize. There are many different concepts of the city and the urban that are out there, but this is sort of a generalization about what I take global urban discourse, mainstream global urban discourse, to presuppose. Certain assumptions about the city. Singularity as a settlement type that makes cities, even though they may be internally diverse, distinct from all other settlement types. Towns, villages, the rural, the countryside. So again, it's not that all cities are the same. I mean, these days we have lots of very important arguments about the many different types of cities, global north, global south, etc. And that's very important. But underlying those descriptions of diversity is a kind of claim that the city is a particular type of spatial form. And second, this is very contradictory, the idea that the city is bounded. So that it's, at some point, there's a separation between the inside and the outside. This is very contested in the sense that some of the most sophisticated contemporary urbanists are very appropriately obsessed with the ways in which cities constantly explode their own boundaries. So Shlomo Angel, one of the most sophisticated urban scholars who uses geospatial data, has spent the last really 20 years looking at the ways in which urban expansion has exploded urban territories. But at the same time, he's constantly interested in bounding the city, figuring out where the city ends. Did this shut down? Perfect. Can y'all hear me better now, or what's that? Should I rewind? I have 2 minutes left. Actually, I only have 16 minutes left, so I better watch out. Are we good or no? Should I rewind the previous 2 minutes? I don't think I can. I'm kind of rolling here. Anyway, the idea that it's bounded. And then thirdly, and this is actually very paradoxical in the sense that these days, particularly in urban geography, there's a lot of emphasis on the need to reveal the specificity of different types of cities and urbanization processes around the world. That's become a very sort of prominent strand of urban research. But amidst all of the emphasis on the diversity of types of cities, there's a kind of underlying notion that it's the city that has been generalized and diffused. So it's like the shell is like a universal shell, and then the content or the form is a universal form. That's maybe a better way to put it. And the content is always particular. But the form of the city has been diffused and generalized around the world. And this is one way to encapsulate that. This comes from Kingsley Davis, who basically came up with the formula of urbanization that I would argue continues to be the hegemonic, fundamental, mainstream assumption in pretty much all approaches to urbanization even from Marxist to kind of mainstream demographic ones, which is simply the idea that urbanization is the size of the population in a territory relative to the total population of the territory. That's Kingsley Davis, like in the 1950s. And that's basically what, in broad strokes, that's what the UN still presupposes, although in fact the census data upon which the UN is relying when it declares that we've crossed the 50% world urban threshold, they're quite different because every country in the world has its own particular set of criteria. But there's still the notion that what we're measuring, this is the point, what we're measuring when we talk about urbanization is the growth of cities relative to some other part of the territory that's not a city space. And I'll stand by that statement. That is the widely assumed or generally assumed, taken for granted assumption about what urbanization means. So my question is, to what degree is this inherited city-centric conception of the urban adequate for understanding contemporary transformations? And I want to argue that it's radically inadequate. And the claim, let me hasten to add, is not that the city doesn't matter, or not that agglomerations don't matter, but precisely the challenge is to think about, and again, this goes back to really Nikos' main argument this morning, the connections between the spaces we call cities and everything else. What is all that everything else, which is really what a lot of this conference has actually been about. But it puts into relief the relationship in terms of analyzing something like the Capitalocene or the Anthropocene. The problematique that I'm putting forward with my collaborators is, what does it look like if we try to grasp the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene specifically in terms of the dialectics between city building and the transformation of everything else? I've got some more specific concepts for getting at that, but that's the issue that we're putting forward. So me and Christian Schmidt wrote a paper a couple years ago which was really critically trying to reflect on and supersede this city-centric model and really question the idea. We may live in an age of urbanization, whether it's an urban age or a city age, highly dubious proposition. Our view is that the notion of a 50% world urban threshold is empirically problematic and theoretically dangerous. So if you want to know why, please have a look at our paper. But this, the book Implosions, Explosions that I edited a couple years back, what I want to draw your attention to in terms of just crystallizing the politics behind this approach is the cover image, which hopefully you'll recognize. It's the tar sands in northern Alberta, Canada. And what I want to put forward, I don't have the answer to this, but I think this is the challenge. We need an approach to the theory of urbanization that is as well equipped to analyze conditions like this, industrial ecocide, through extraction of fossil fuels in this case, the connections between these kinds of conditions, of which there are many, and the growth of cities. Once we bound the problematique of urban theory to simply focus on the growth of cities, the concept of externalization has been productively used all day. We're externalizing this, and both intellectually and cartographically and politically. And that is not possible, and that is not productive if we want to develop an urban theory that's actually illuminating and politically oriented. So I'm going to skip all that. So so how do we do that? So basically in my remaining time, I want to offer some steps. They're just offerings about how we can begin to do that. I don't think that me and Christian have done that. We're trying to move in that direction. So let me also be clear that the ideas that we've been offering on planetary urbanization, they're not a complete framework. Here's the answer. Here's the total theory of the urban. We do not have such a thing. And if we ever have something that more closely confronts this challenge, it can only be developed collectively. So me and Christian understand ourselves as working as part of a broader intellectual, scholarly community with social scientists, designers, ecologists, philosophers, to try to develop such a thing. So these are simply offerings to sort of find a way to confront the challenge. And I also happen to believe that the design disciplines and the intelligence, the critical intelligence, the radical intelligence of design is fundamentally relevant for that task. Not design alone, but design's got to be part of the kind of collective project, which is why I like teaching in a design school and being in conversations like this. So here's some openings and then some consequences. So first of all, the urban is not a unit. I'm basically throwing out the last 100 years, not dismissing, but superseding the idea that the urban is a settlement type. From a governmental point of view, it might look like a settlement type. But that doesn't mean we should use that assumption as a category of analysis of critical theory. 1. 2, the process unfolds in diverse sites, territories, landscapes. So the search for the singular morphology of the urban, the Chicago school, the LA school, the whatever school, and there's lots of attempts out there to say, here's the new model of the urban. I think that's not helpful, because I believe that the urban, in its essence, is variegated. So the notion that there's a singular urban, which then gets reproduced in variations thereof, I think that's a dubious ontological and epistemological frame. The very nature of the urban and the process of urbanization is the production of spatial differentiation. That's a very Lefebvrean concept, by the way. So there's no singular morphology. We've got to track the patterns, the variegations of urbanization processes across time and across space. 3, really the same point stated more succinctly. The spatialities of the urban are polymorphic. In some of my other work with Bob Jessup and Martin Jones and Gordon MacLeod, we talk about different dimensions of sociospatial relations. So acronym TPSN, Territory, Place, Scale, Network. And I don't think that list is complete. And I know I'm going to get in trouble with Stuart, although we actually agree on a lot of this issue. But when we wrote that article, me and my colleagues, we understood territory simply as bounded spaces, and place as kind of concentration, scale as a vertical hierarchization of space, and network as kind of interconnectedness. And Stuart Elden has really been at the forefront of helping us understand that territory is not simply about bounding space. It's more about kind of a technology of power, a concept that someone else used this morning. So I fully take on board that idea. In this context, my point is simply that urbanization as a process, we shouldn't simplify it to a singular dimension of space. So Castells in the Network Society talks about nodes and connection between cities. Agglomeration theorists emphasize place. Political scientists tend to think of cities and the urban as a territorial zone of jurisdictions. And scale, there's a whole politics of scale related to the rescaling of the urban. All of these are relevant, but it's an empirical and historical question how to combine them in different ways. So that's just one offering for how to start to open up a more polymorphic spatialization of the urban. 4, the city is not a settlement type or a spatial form, but it's part of a broader and uneven process of urbanization. So again, I'm not dismissing or discounting or even minimizing the importance of cities, agglomerations, whatever we mean by that, in the urbanization process, but it's one among many expressions of the urbanization process. So I'm building here very strongly on Henri Lefebvre, who makes a fundamental distinction between the city and the urban. And that's a starting point for this approach, which is the source of a lot of confusion, actually, in the current geography literature. There are many spatial forms of agglomeration. So even agglomeration can't be reduced simply to any singular notion of the city. So it's, again, I'm questioning the idea of, in a certain way, the real critique is less of city-centrism as such than the idea of the city as something that's singular and universal. Urban agglomeration is intertwined with any number of transformations of land use, the key focus of Nikos's presentation earlier, and sociospatial environments beyond the city centers. What we need to look at is the connections. So a couple consequences. This is probably the most fundamental one, and let me just crystallize it as precisely as I can. So all major definitions of urbanization define urbanization as city growth. And they think of that connection between urbanization and city growth as basically what philosophers call an analytic proposition. So an example of an analytic proposition in philosophy of language is a triangle has 3 sides. or a bachelor is an unmarried man. The subject and the predicate mutually contain one another. You can debate about the social and cultural construction of bachelorhood, but basically the definition of bachelor is an unmarried man. A triangle, by definition, is a shape with three sides. It's just they're mutually contained with one another. So all the major definitions and understandings of urbanization treat urbanization as city growth as just analytically self-evident. You can debate about what a city is and the mechanisms underlying city growth and the consequences, and that's what a lot of urban social science is all about. It's all very interesting. But the proposition that urbanization is city growth, it's understood simply as a self-evident definitional fact. My position on this matter is the following. I do believe there is an essential intrinsic connection between urbanization and city growth, but it's not analytically contained in the definition of urbanization. So what we need to do is explore historically, in theoretically reflexive terms, what is the connection between urbanization and city growth? And as I've been arguing, urbanization is also connected to many other spatial arrangements. So I'm questioning the analytic self-evidence of the link between urbanization and city growth rather than the idea that there is any connection at all. Urban restructuring is not simply a mutation of city space, but it's a multi-scalar process of implosion and explosion that encompasses diverse landscapes, scales, and ecologies. And then thirdly, this is really at the heart of all my present work, the hinterland question. Historically, the hinterland question, the transformation of the countryside, has been understood as something sort of separate from the question of the urban or the urban question. So you have people in agrarian studies, people who study extraction, environmental studies, generally outside the city. So there are these different disciplinary containers. The urban people do one thing, and the other scholars study the outside. And I'm suggesting that that disciplinary division of labor, which takes different forms in different fields, is obsolete. And that the hinterland question is today a central part. The urban question is a central part of the hinterland question. So Christian Schmid and I developed this concept, this distinction between concentrated and extended urbanization. Nikos introduced it earlier today briefly, also in relation to differential urbanization, but I'll leave differential to one side for the moment. But basically, in a nutshell, concentrated urbanization is the dimension of urbanization that involves implosion, the clustering together of sociospatial relations. And extended urbanization is broadly construed the hinterland question. It's the operationalization of non-city spaces to support the growth of the city and the consequences of the growth of the city for non-city spaces. So it could be agrarian industrial development. It could be resource extraction. It could be logistics. It could be ecosystem services, like we heard in some of the earlier presentations about various kinds of financialized environmental management. For me, that's definitely part of extended urbanization. Differential urbanization simply refers to the ways in which the sociospatial configurations that underpin both concentrated and extended urbanization are subjected to waves of creative destruction. Historically, urban theorists tend to focus on creative destruction in big metropolitan regions. So David Harvey's idea that through sequences or cycles of crisis-induced restructuring, the built environments of metropolitan regions undergo major waves of transformation. What Christian and I are suggesting is that hinterland spaces also undergo parallel waves of systematic spatial reorganization. It's not just the investment in certain infrastructures to support agriculture, logistics, extraction, environmental management, but that those very infrastructures at a certain moment in the development of capitalism are also subjected to waves of creative destruction. So there's a dynamism of both cities and hinterlands. The hinterland is not a backwater, it's not ghost acreage, it's a dynamic site of capitalist development, and the developmental dynamics of cities and hinterlands, particularly in the current period, are closely intertwined with one another. So that's just kind of a summary of our distinction. And I was just being a little bit playful with this, but since Kingsley Davis had his formula of urbanization is the population of cities over the total population, I think Nikos was there when we were fooling around with this, and I made a little diagram. And the double arrow is, of course, the universal symbol of a dialectical relationship. So I'm just kind of joking. Anyway, I've got a bunch of slides on concentrated, extended, but I'm actually going to conclude. I'm not going to unpack it. I think there's a few things to work with here. But I'm going to have to, just give me 1 second to go to the very end of my slides. And you're going to see how many slides that I, in the 45-minute scenario, would have gone through, but we're just going to skip it all. Don't worry. No problem. Yeah, let's just go right back there. Invite me back, and we can go into more detail. But it's the end of the day, and we want to hear from Stuart. So there's a question about the historical geographies of urbanization. And all the periodizations of urbanization that are out there, again, whether it's mainstream sociology, Marxism, it's basically the changing morphology of the city. And part of what I'm interested in, and Christian and I in our collaborative work, is how do you rethink the history of capitalist urbanization once you open up that distinction between concentrated and extended? You need actually a new periodization. Henri Lefebvre is helpful on this, but actually not that helpful. He gives us a few hints, but this is work that remains to be done. We have to go back to literatures that are usually distinct from urban literatures in order to excavate this. To some degree, the debates on the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene provide a way into it. But again, I've talked to Jason Moore a lot about this very question, and I think he's sympathetic to the proposal. The geographies within the Capitalocene literature are in some ways underdeveloped. And we're suggesting, again, just one geographical vector, which is the dialectics between concentrated and extended urbanization, as a way to think about these historical transformations. Jason Moore, of course, would date the Capitalocene back much earlier than the 1870s. But I'm very interested. I think it's consistent with Henri Lefebvre's ideas, for better or for worse, that there's an intrinsic connection between urbanization and capitalist industrialization. So this periodization, but this is more of just posing the question like that. I've got further ideas about this, which I don't have time to share, but it's just sort of opening up precisely in order to understand the specificity of this moment. In other words, something is going on now in the relationship. It's not just about the importance of cities, but for me, it's the relationship between zones of concentrated urbanization and zones of extended urbanization. In the current moment, by which, for me and Christian, post-1980s. That's kind of a moment of, for us, fundamental transformation towards something like a planetary formation of urbanization. So final propositions, which are just invitations for further debate. Because again, we don't have the answers, we just got some questions that we need, hopefully, to work on collectively with friends and comrades. It's not the world that has become urban. This is a proposition which I'm also very influenced by some of Stuart Elden's wonderful essays on the space of the world. So that the idea that the world has become urban implies that the world already exists. And then you're just filling up this shell or this sphere with urban content. Rather, it's the urban that's being planetarized. So the urban process is the focal point, and then you've got to look at its ongoing mutation to a point where it becomes a planetary configuration. So the urban and the planetary are co-produced through historical, sociospatial relations and contestation. Secondly, and again, this connects up with Nikos's remarks earlier, the hinterland, it wasn't always the case, but increasingly with the forward motion of capitalist development, the hinterland becomes a strategic terrain of urbanization. Not because it contains or might contain cities, but because it's transformed into an operational landscape. Again, a concept Nikos introduced with his distinction earlier between agglomeration landscapes and operational landscapes. So it means a zone of, you're not just, in Marxian terms, it's not just formal subsumption, that you're producing something in the hinterland for the world market, but real subsumption. You're actually reorganizing the territory in a way to facilitate expanded capital accumulation. And that very closely articulates to some of Stuart Elden's ideas about territory as a political technology. So the hinterland is very much a territory in that particular sense, or at least it becomes one. And then thirdly and finally, and I'll leave it I'll leave it here. I think I actually almost succeeded in 30 minutes. It'll be 35. Sorry about that, y'all. But hopefully you'll appreciate that I tried to restrain myself a little bit from those intermediary slides. But anyway, the specificity of planetary urbanization for me and Christian, it's less about the universalization of the city or the generalized importance of metropolitan regions as engines of the global economy, as Alan Scott once put it. But rather, it's related to the intensified operationalization of hinterlands and their ecologies to support the growth and extension of city building around the world. So for me, the specificity of this moment really has a lot to do with what's going on outside the city. So it's a bit of an odd, possibly an odd or even paradoxical claim for an urban theorist such as myself to make that the world is being urbanized because of stuff that's going on in the hinterland. But that's where I've landed with my work thus far. And it leads me not to simply abandon the city as irrelevant, as Patrick Schumacher accused me of doing in an exchange that we had in AD a couple years back. It was pretty interesting. But rather, looking at the hinterland as a way to understand the city and trying to understand the ways in which cities and their developmental dynamics are connected to transformations of the hinterland. So again, I return to exactly Nikos's core argument of urbanization as geographical reorganization related to increasing modes of connectivity and infrastructures to facilitate that connectivity between cities and their erstwhile outsides. Thank you very much. Let's turn it over to Stuart.
Came up with a kind of rough framework for what I wanted to say, and I've been filling in detail in response both to what Neil has said, but also some of the other presentations today. So it's a sort of a half scripted and half improvised talk, and I'm going to really try to keep to 15 minutes maximum. So you're not going to get a big critique of Neil's work. As Neil hinted, we've been friends for a long time. We've worked together, particularly around Henri Lefebvre's work. So instead of a kind of critique of kind of what's wrong with this, it's going to be more kind of pushing it, relating it to my work, thinking about how it might connect to some themes that have been discussed today and that I've been exploring in my work. I think this concentrated urbanization idea is really fertile, it's really productive. It's really helped me in thinking about issues of urban centers and kind of going beyond that. But particularly the thing I like from it is this sense of urbanization as process, which is really important to how I've been trying to think about the question of territory. I do have some questions in terms of how the extended urbanization of particular places, whether they're in an early formulation that Neil and his colleagues used, the extreme territories of urbanization, through to now what's being called operational landscapes or strategic terrains of urbanization. And for me, we really need to think about how these are produced as territories or as landscapes and the concrete material processes that shape and transform them. And the notion of terrain, which is coming in now, is really important to me. And I think it's a really helpful concept, but I think it's one that we need to do a lot of work with theoretically. And as Neil hinted, territory's been very much the theme of a lot of what I've been doing and how that would connect to that TPSN idea that Neil published in Society and Space, a piece with Martin Jones and Bob Jessup. Now, I'm going to generalize enormously here in a historical transformation. There is a book called The Birth of Territory that I wrote that is a very long book that tries to talk about this in a lot of detail, but hear me out on this very quick schematic thing. There's a significant moment in Western thought when the relation between the urban and territory changed. In antiquity, you have what we might call urban centers. Have a territory. There is a territory or there is something outside. So the Greek polis has a horror, a country or a countryside or a landscape outside of it, land perhaps. So horror here, not in the technical sense that it has in Plato's Timaeus, but the very everyday, mundane sense that it has in Plato's Laws, or it has in Aristotle's Politics, and so on. And the Roman urbis has the only way that the term territorium is used in classical Latin, the surrounding lands around the city. So what you have here is that the urban is not a territory, and the urban is not in a territory, but the urban has a territory. Right, that's a crude way of putting it, but that's the quickest way I can summarize what I think happened in antiquity. In the late Middle Ages in Western Europe, I think this changes in that you have things that are understood as territorium, what we would now call territories, in which there are urban areas. That seems to me to be an important moment when that shifts. And that, I think, forms the model for a lot of the way that we've thought about these things in so-called modernity. And I think it's the inherited kind of sense that we have of these questions that Neil and others are kind of pushing against today. And that in a sense, what's happening here is that the old idea of the hinterland, the area outside of a Greek polis or a Roman urbis, the hinterland is now being thought again in that relation about how we think about the urban and its hinterland. And I think we're potentially, I mean, there is always that danger of presentism that we think that our own present moment is a significant shift from something that has happened in the past. But that relation between those terms, that I think there was an antiquity moment and there was a modernity moment, I think we maybe need to rethink and work through that question about what is this relation between the territory and the urban. Is it the territory becoming urbanized or the urban becoming territorialized, or even, as we go up even further in scale, the planetary or the world? But in all of this, however we might conceptualize it, I think it's the territory and it's the relation between those that we need to think of, rather than these somehow static objects. I have a piece in the forthcoming Wiley-Blackwell Encyclopedia of Urban and Regional Studies, or whatever it's exactly called. I wrote the piece so long ago and it's taken so long to come out that I can't even remember the title of the collection. But it's on territory and territoriality in relation to the urban. And in that, I tried to kind of survey urban work that uses terms around territory and territorialization. And I tried to kind of come up with a systematization of that and a kind of critique of it, because it seemed to me that the term territory was used in an incredibly loose way within a lot of that work. And I think that one of the problems that urban theory has when it talks about territory is that it still thinks of territory as a container, or territory as a bounded space. And I think what Neil is doing with Christian and others, exploding this idea of the urban as a bounded space, we need to do the same with the notion of territory. So just as that notion of the dot is problematic, we also need to think about the problem of thinking of territory as a straightforward container. Anthony Giddens, the state is a bordered power container as a kind of way of conceptualizing its territory. Or the standard definition you get in international relations or political geography, a territory is a bounded space under the control of a group of people, perhaps a state, and then we look at the relations between those bounded spaces. It seems to me that's a really problematic definition for at least two reasons. One is not all bounded spaces are territories, and equally not all territories are bounded spaces. The bounded space is not sufficient to grasp the complexity of the notion of territory. And even one of the best theorists of territory, who's also a really significant theorist of the urban, Jean Gottman, the Megalopolis book, but also The Significance of Territory, two great books in urban studies and in territory studies, he still conceives of the urban territory largely as a container which gets progressively more urbanized through these processes. Now, the last line of my new book, which I'll say a bit about in a moment, the last line of my book is we need to think territory beyond the pale. A pale is a geographically bounded, delimited area, a jurisdiction. The English Pale in Ireland, the Pale of Calais. A bounded space, it comes from hunting originally. It's a bounded hunting area in which animals could live and could be hunted in a way. Now access in, but not access out for these animals. We need to break from the idea that a territory is a pale. And that's one of the arguments I try and make in that book. So how might we theorize territory? I mean, I've written a lot about territory in a range of works where I try to say, well, there's many ways that we think about territory. In relation to land, we think of it effectively as a political economic category, and we just scale it up from individual property of land to a state's property over its territory. Or we think about it in kind of geostrategic terms, effectively kind of thinking about it in terms of the power relations and about the wars and things that are fought over it. I think those are both absolutely crucial to understanding the notion of territory, but for me, they're not sufficient to grasp the complexity. So in Terror and Territory, a very political book about the so-called war on terror and really the post-Cold War world, and in The Birth of Territory is a political book that looks at the development of the concept of territory in Western political thought, I say as well as that kind of political economic and political strategic, we need to take very seriously the political legal and the political technical. And I still hold to that as two really important additional dimensions that we need to take into account. But what I do in the Shakespearean Territories book, which really should be out now, I was hoping I could wave a copy at you, but my publisher, University of Chicago Press, tells me that due to paper shortages in the United States, the printing has been slightly delayed. So here's a chain or something kind of argument about the of intellectual knowledge. So I'm sorry that I don't have a copy of the Shakespeare book, but it is imminent. It should be out next week, if not this.
It's a hinterland question. Why is Chicago sourcing its paper? That's an interesting hinterland question. Just saying.
It is, absolutely. Yeah. Let me, I'm not going to say a great deal about that book, but what I basically do in that book is I use readings of different plays by Shakespeare to open up different aspects of the question of territory. So I use Richard II's to talk about the political economies of land. I do a kind of a regional geopolitics reading of Hamlet, the Hamlet himself and the father and the uncle story slightly to the margins, and talk about the relations that Denmark has to Norway and to Poland. So I do readings to try and think about these different aspects of territory. But I also use Shakespeare to push me beyond simply the economic, strategic, legal, and technical that I'd done in previous work. I use Shakespeare to force me to account for the colonial. I do a reading of Coriolanus to think about bodies, the kind of corporeal territories, bodies in places. And the one that connects most to other work that I've done is I do a reading of the first part of Henry IV, where I talk about rivers. There's three characters who how they're going to divide up the kingdom after they've overthrown the king, and they're dividing up the kingdom by using rivers, the River Trent and the River Severn. And they say, well, these rivers form these boundaries, and these will be the portions of the kingdom that we will take once we've defeated the king. And one of them goes, hang on a minute, this river's in the wrong place. My share of the land isn't as big as the others. And actually what we need to do is not choose another line on the map, or even another river. We need to change the course of the river in order that it flows in a different channel and it distributes the land more fairly and evenly between us. So I use this as a way into thinking about the relation between what I call the geopolitical and the geophysical in those terms. Now, the geophysical is the term that I've done the most work with since I wrote the Birth of Territory book. There's a couple of papers that I think what I've been trying to do, or I'm drawing on a number of other people's work and trying to theorize this geophysical, geopolitical relation. One of them is a piece called Secure the Volume, which came out in 2013 in Political Geography, where I connect up work on urban geopolitics, on critical architecture, verticality debates, subterranean work, and try and explore the politics of space in 3 dimensions. But I'm not simply interested in another up-down vertical axis, but trying to think about things like slopes, surfaces, tunneling, bridges, and try and complicate the way that we too often think about territory in terms of a kind of cartographic imagination if we turn it into a 2-dimensional surface. I'm preaching to the choir here with architects of, you all know this, but I think political geographers have been slow to think about space in those ways. The most recent one where I've developed some of these themes is in a piece that's in the London Review of International Law, which is around this notion of terrain as a way of trying to get at the political materiality of territory. And I'm trying to think, as I said, it's geophysical versus geopolitical, about how these things connect, whether it's rivers, whether it's mountains, whether it's deserts, whether it's coastlines changing, these kinds of geophysical processes and the relation that they have to geopolitical kinds of questions. And these obviously have urban implications in terms of how we might think about urban materiality and whether terrain is a useful way into thinking about those questions. When I've talked about this, I've said I'm not especially interested in the notion of terrain. I think it's the best concept that we have to make sense of a problem, but terrain has a kind of an inherited baggage that may be problematic. Terrain in geography tends to be associated either with physical geography or with military geography. And in physical geography, terrain has traditionally been understood as land form as opposed to land process. So physical geographers, when I've talked about terrain as a process, have gone, no, terrain isn't the process, it's something else is the process to terrain. I'm trying to break from the idea that there is some kind of static thing to which things are done. I'm trying to get at this idea of the process in itself. And the military geography, well, there's a long-standing literature in military geography about how physical terrain conditions what the army can do. Can you get your tanks over this land? Is the land too sandy or too boggy for the tanks to be supported on it? You should station your troops up on the hilltop because that's the easier place to defend. So there's a long-standing military geography that looks at that. I'm really interested in work by people like Rachel Woodward who turn it around and say, not look at the impact of the landscape on the military, but look at the impact of the military on the landscape. And Shaila Krupa's done fantastic work on this in the Hotspotters report, the kind of military legacies of industrial and nuclear waste in large parts of the Southwest United States. So I'm interested in that side of military geography or militarized geographies rather than the older style version of the geography is there as a condition that might limit how the army can actually operate. But I think there's potential for a huge amount of new work around this. Whether terrain is the right concept, I'm not sure. I'm not particularly invested in it yet. But I do think the political materiality of territory connecting to the urban or to outside urban questions would be a really important thing to explore in relation to that. I'm at 15 minutes, so I'm not going to talk about some of the other things I thought we might talk about. I just want to raise the question that Neil and I explored in a piece we wrote on Lefebvre in 2009, or it came out in 2009, on Henri Lefebvre and state-space territory, where we talk about the notion of the territory effect, which we described as the state's tendency through its territorial form to naturalize at once, to mask and to normalize its own transformative effects on socio-spatial relations. And I think that one of the problems that we have today with the question of territory is that if you work on territory, as a lot of my work has been, people think it's because you like territory, or that you think territory is even the explanation. Territory is the problem. Territory is the issue that I think needs explaining. It is not the thing that I am using to interpret everything else, but I think it's something that we have there, and I think it's a problem, and we need to get out of it. I think we have a fundamentally impoverished kind of geopolitical imagination that we cannot seem to imagine anything other than territory today. And that when we talk about the problems of borders, or we talk about our opposition to walls, people say, well, where would you draw the border, or where would you draw the wall? And but what if we said that that was itself the problem? And I think the historical approach, and Neil hinted at this, and other papers have hinted at this, if you look back, and you don't have to look back that far, this was a profoundly alien way of structuring and organizing socio-spatial relations. And that we too often feel trapped by that. And for me, that's the sense of the territorial trap. I think John Agnew diagnoses a problem, but I think we can still do more when we think about the problems of these kinds of notions. People talked about the violence embedded, it came from that Noam Chomsky work, the violence embedded in a border, the violence embedded in the infrastructure or the architecture that is on a border. For me, there's a violence in the concept of a border, in the concept of a territory, and that might be something that we need to think about more. I was also really struck by a number of papers today that connected the bodies in the places to the places embodied. And for me, I think that and I would certainly include my work in this. Most work on territory has looked at the geopolitics of territory. I'm kind of interested in whether we could push further and look at the biopolitics of territory. And that might be a topic for me to think more about. I think it connects to debates on the urban. I think it connects to some of the debates that have been talked about today. But that's my quick attempt at throwing out even more questions. Thank you.
Thank you both for the presentations. We have like 25 minutes. Hopefully we have a short and compact but fruitful conversation. Maybe I will start and then I will open questions to the floor. Stuart, maybe in a similar way that we come on here. In a similar way that we tend to imagine more feasible the end of the world of capitalism, no? Like that's the typical phrase that we hear nowadays. It seems to be something similar happening with territory, no? Like, why cannot imagine other ways, no? Let's say to relate ourselves or relate power with places, no? And perhaps planetary urbanization is a way, or at least the way Brenner and Neil is kind of posing that to kind of overcome that sort of impasse in which we are.
And maybe just say just one thing, which is, this is both response to this point, but also where Stuart ended, territory effect. I find it really weird not to sit because I can't see people's faces. It's just kind of weird. Is this okay? Is this one on? No, I just wanted to say that the point Stuart's making about the territory effect, which is the ways in which the state naturalizes its own effects on the production of territory, this is a really fundamental challenge for design. The question is, so you all are working with visualizations all the time. And the question is, what are you going to do with your visualization? Are you going to accept territory or the urban as something taken for granted and then aestheticize it? Or I should say we, because I'm part of it too. Or are we going to use the intelligence and the methods and the capacities of design precisely in order to deconstruct the territory effect or other kinds of effects, the urban effect as well? And I think that's a real tension within design discourse between approaches that reproduce dominant spatial ideologies and their naturalization of processes and their kind of inscription in the landscape versus approaches that destabilize those naturalized assumptions. So the territory effect, like when we came up with that concept, we weren't thinking about design. But now that Stuart brings it back in a conversation like this, it's sort of striking to me how it might relate to some of the amazing projects that were reported on earlier today, and just where one positions one work, whether in relation to the territory effect or other naturalizations of power that are inscribed in space and the ways in which representational techniques might disrupt or not such naturalizations.
I'm happy to throw it open to.
Any question?
This is a question I've tried to, and maybe I've raised it to Neil before, I don't remember, but to kind of put it on the, to exaggerate it, a lot of the work that you've been doing in the Urban Theory Lab is a kind of spatialization of networks of production, among other things. And earlier today, it was the moderator, I forget the name, she brought up this issue of kind of subjectivity in geographic representation. And I want to kind of flip that and say that there is subjectivity in the way the different technologies kind of have a disposition or a spatial disposition. And that by compounding these processes under the umbrella or the concept of urbanization, however you process it, it is compounded. And if you are tracing their effects in space, you're not necessarily looking into the spatialities or the frameworks in which they evolve. And I regret to bring that reference, but it's a kind of like object-oriented question of like, how do you begin to approach or get closer at what kind of disposition types of technology have on space, because we have to, I guess we can all agree that they have some agency as well. I mean, they, it, whatever it is, that is the momentum within those systems. It's not just capitalists having designs, fully conscious designs. I mean, there is momentum in them as well. And I wonder if that's something that could be, when you bring up this ambition of trying to understand the ecocide, or having a framework that analyzes that as well as the growth of cities, can we get on the inside of that, whatever drives that process, from the perspective of some kind of technological evolution or some kind of column modeling, iterative? Yeah, that's the question.
Should we collect a few since it's the last session, and maybe this way we get more voices into the conversation? We'll take notes and then maybe just field some questions, and then at some point Stuart and I can sort of see what we want to respond to. I'm just saying that way we get more conversations going. Yeah.
I'll move back. My question is there a relationship between the ideas of territory and scale? Oftentimes you hear the term territorial scale, and I've been, I suppose, reflecting on why we say that. In my mind, I usually use territorial scale as somehow to wrap in complexity, mobility, conflicting uses. But I wonder if there is actually a territorial scale, or could smaller things also have a territory to them?
Thanks very much. You know, I always have a great difficulty in the sort of language that theoretical geographers use, and find it quite alienating these days, if I might say. And trying to articulate why that is because it would appear that matter doesn't matter in these conversations. And I mean, I'm thinking of Bob Beauregard's wonderful book, Planning with Matter, in which he sort of fesses up to the fact that planning theory so often ignores the fact that these are material processes. They're not just production process. They're not just abstract value production, but they're material. And I just wondered the extent to which the sort of physicality, which Stuart started to suggest with the idea of starts to kind of fight back. It's not just neutral, it's actually quite active in these processes that you're discussing.
I'm just passing this to Mitesh, but I'm going to pause for a moment before I give him the microphone. I wanted to just draw the three conversations together and ask you a question from that. And early this morning, Caroline Knowles mentioned Dori Massey in part of her presentation. And Dori Massey, obviously she wrote the book For Space, where she makes a claim to space being a process. And it resonated very strongly with many of the descriptions that Neil, you set out for the urban. But Dori Massey also describes place as stories so far, and I think there's association there between process and stories. And obviously we heard from Rania describing her approach to exploring sort of very big issues through storytelling. And I was wondering whether you would like to touch on, let's say, a potential relationship between storytelling, stories, and process, and how that might allow us to elaborate further some of these issues that you've mentioned.
I think that's enough, no? If you just do, I can ask you later.
You guys are on a roll, like let's keep it going. I mean, also the back of the room, I think at this point, everyone's been patiently listening all day, so.
And the more questions we have, the more we can ignore the difficult ones.
Exactly. I didn't want to say that, but no, but I mean, up to you. But I'm happy to just let's let people reflect and have a collective conversation.
This one's gonna be completely not personal, but something I need to be answered for my own work. So lately, I've been looking at sort of this compare territory, say pre-Cartesian logic, pre-sort of colonization versus post-colonization for specifically India. And how India as a construct, right? Is that the name was invented by the British, and so specifically, like Northern India, where I'm from originally, how, you know, I speak Urdu, I'm more in common with, say, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So have you in your own work looked at sort of territory pre-map, pre-Cartesian logic, pre-colonization to see, because a lot of things I think we're talking about were there, you know, that the material reality actually created, like there was no Gujarat or Punjab. I mean, there was, but the movement between culture, language, food was so okay, so fluid, right? And then the Cartesian sort of decarbonization of India created the other, and that sort of territory definitely generates the other and the distinction. So I was wondering if your own work, because I'm sort of looking for this sort of research myself, is how has the pre-Descartesian map or territory influenced your own work?
One more question, sorry. This is from a conversation that we had together with Douglas Spencer and Stuart some months ago. But since you finished with this idea about the territory effect and this normalization or naturalization of power, I also want to bring Cosgrove's idea of landscape as this aesthetic apparatus that serves as the legitimization of the relationship, of a vision on the relationship between society and nature. And that is also like this form of validation and naturalization or greenwashing, if you like. So I'd like to ask you, how does this idea of landscape relate to the idea of the agglomeration, landscapes of agglomeration and the hinterland that you mentioned? And maybe I could extend this question to Stuart. And what do you think is the relationship with the territory?
Should we keep it going? It looks like someone else might be on the
There's
same
one
track.
more, and then maybe we should try and try. Yeah.
Okay, it's come to the backlands now.
I think there's,
So, I'm a bit of an accidental tourist in your field, so I was interested if you could maybe help me join the dots between ideas, some of them pretty old ideas, and concepts which came from Wallerstein and his world systems theory, and how that's kind of migrated through. As we know, ideas travel. Some things stick, some things don't. And how some of these ideas have found themselves through Sasson and her latest work on expulsions, and perhaps how your work connects to our reconceptualization of these uneven geographies, these asymmetries in both power and process, and where it leaves us now, really. You know, what do we draw, what do we see, and what the hell do we do?
right on. Exactly. Should I go start? Yeah, please do. I can try to.
Is this, yeah, okay. Let me start with India by saying I'm not qualified to talk about India. But what I tried to do in the Birth of Territory book, which does, the majority of that book is before Descartes. Descartes comes in chapter 8, I think. And the great surprise to me in writing that was how important the Middle Ages was in Western Europe in terms of formation, some of the categories and the ideas. That the idea that there is a kind of a classical notion around these things and then it all sort of falls away and then it gets reintroduced in the Renaissance, early modern period. I think that story doesn't work, at least for what I was talking about. And so what was initially a kind of, I didn't want to do that thing that history of political thought courses always do, or history of philosophy. Aristotle, fast forward to Descartes, and then carry on. And I didn't want to do that, nor did I want to do a tokenistic, let's do St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. And I spent half the book on the Middle Ages and learnt an enormous amount in terms of trying to think about those ideas. I do think fundamental happens, and Descartes is one of the emblematic fundamental figures in Western thought, but I try very hard not to do the old kind of trap about those ideas. But it is a Western European story that I tell. And the reasons for that was that I tried to trace every text that I used back to the original language. Because if you read Plato's Laws or Aristotle's Politics in an English translation, or Caesar's War in Gaul, you will find the term territory all over the place. But if you actually check back to the Greek and the Latin, there is no term that actually is equivalent to our modern notion of territory. Territorium is never used by any of the Roman historians that we have still extant texts. Caesar never uses it. Livy, Tacitus, does not appear. They use other words to talk about something that's quite close to our notion of territory, but not use the term territorium. And when territorium gets used, and it's an incredibly rare word in classical Latin, it's a much more common word in medieval Latin. So I make this argument, the textual is really, really significant if we're looking at this relation between words and concepts and how they're designated and then how they relate to practice. And the limits of my ability mean that Western European languages is where I can do that work to some muddling through kind of degree. I couldn't go beyond and do the kind of global work, but what I hope was that something that I did in there maybe gave some conceptual tools in terms of an approach, or that particular way I talked about territory as the political, economic, strategic, legal, technical, and so on. Could that be useful for somebody else doing that work for other times? And so on. And that was the sort of the hope with some of the work I was doing. So Matthew Edney's book on mapping an empire would be the place I'd say, if you want to think about India, that would be, I think, one of the key places to look. Manu Goswami's Producing India would be another one. So, there are works that do that kind of thinking, but that's not what I've tried to do. Territory at all scales come up as a question. I mean, some people think a room, a building, an area of a city, up to a nation state, maybe the globe, all of these are territories. And I kind of have some sympathy to that, but equally I think if the concept of territory becomes so diffuse, it actually starts to become fairly meaningless. And so I've been quite resistant to the idea that territory is straightly movable between different scales. Or if it is, then we need another concept to make sense of the kind of the nation-state territory question, which I think is a particular notion. And so for me, territory has to have some kind of specificity if it is possible, but that doesn't mean that it is a narrow and straightforwardly defined concept. A lot of what I try and do with the conceptual work is to say, these are the kind of registers that we would need to examine in order to understand how territory has been understood, conceptualized, practiced in different times and different places. So it's not a definition that is fixed and ahistorical, but if you investigate these kinds of themes, you might be able to build up a picture of what that is. The theme of the outside, which kind of I know connects to Neil's work, and it's something that I've tried to think about particularly recently. In the Shakespeare book, I have a chapter called Planetary, where I try to think about what it might mean to be outside territory. And I don't mean out of a territory. Right? Today, it's easy to leave a territory and you end up in another territory. What would it mean to be outside of territorial logic, territorial orderings? I think Shakespeare still has a glimpse of what that might be possible. But I think it's fast disappearing at the time that Shakespeare's writing. Places are becoming enclosed. Places are becoming incorporated into territorial logics. But I think in some of Shakespeare's plays, there is still a sense of something that is outside and still evades those kind of logics. But I think it's something that's disappearing at his time. I think he captures it best in some of his history plays, the Roman history plays or the English history plays. But I think that outside important question, it connects certainly to some of the things that Neil has been talking about. And I suppose the last thing that I'd just say, and I know I'm not answering all of the questions, but is this on this question of matter. Really trying to push beyond what I know was a largely textual historical work that I did, say, in The Birth of and to try to think about territory much more as a process in a material sense. I don't think I'm very far down that path as yet, but I think it's a problem that I'm trying to grapple with. The physicality of the kind of the geophysics of geopolitics, and I've been kind of playing with these ideas and trying to work them through in different ways. There's a project I'm working with at colleagues that Phil Steinberg at Durham is leading called the Ice Law Project, where ice originally was, do we need a law of ice like we have a law of the sea and a law on land? And ice has now become indeterminate and changing environments. So it's an acronym of which ice is obviously one, but so too are rivers, glaciers or deserts or other kind of geophysical processes. If you think about rivers, I mean, so many of the world's land boundaries either use rivers or cross rivers. And yet rivers are hardly a fixed feature of landscapes. So you have all sorts of problems where you put a geopolitical boundary line through or across or somehow connected to a river, when the river is a material geophysical process is moving. And, or you do things like the Rio Grande where you put it into big concrete channels so it can't move. Or you have these problems where the geophysical and the geopolitical lines start to diverge. And then you have things like Belgium and Holland did recently, where they started to exchange little peninsulas of land either side of the River Mersey, because the river had changed course partly through physical process, but also partly through dredging works to make these navigable channels and so on. And you had these bits of land that were on the kind of wrong side of the river. So they belonged to Belgium, but they were on the Dutch side of the river. And so you have these kind of problems, and I'm thinking about those as kind of complexities. I'm trying. I'm far down that route at the moment, and for me at the moment, terrain is the best notion I have to think about that.
All right, let me make a stab. No, this is awesome. These are such great questions. I'm going to try to be just concise. And I also won't really be able to fully unpack the kinds of things that people are posing, but just to give you a sense of how I would deal with some of the issues. So Namik's point, there were a lot of issues you raised, Namik, but the thing that I want to just say something about is the issue of dynamism and how you map, how you come up with what David Harvey once called a moving map. And I think that's something that everyone here is wrestling with, because we saw that tension in so many of the incredible visualizations. A lot of you used video animation, which were stunning. One challenge of doing video animation is, and this is also some just critical reaction to the incredible work that we saw. One thing that I found also with my students who also use a lot of video animation, and it's incredible, it requires, in my opinion, a lot of tracking. So does a static map, actually, as we all know, but particularly video animation. I just think that it's very hard to understand the density of information that's being visualized when it's animated, and then to interpret it. And I say this to all my students as well who use the video animation. You've got to be more sparing about it, depending on what kind of presentation you're giving, because you need to allocate time to explain. Otherwise, it's the danger, again, a point Namik raised earlier, of it becomes aesthetic. And we appreciate the sort of, again, people, all of you, they're beautiful. And it's easy, whether you're a designer or not, to be dazzled by it. But particularly for the kind of more dissident, counter-ideological kind of projects that so many of you are engaged with, you've got to use your creative capacity, your explanatory capacity to give the video animation its full power. The video animation can't speak for itself. I think people know that around here, but I'm just saying, it will actually be even more powerful if you use, if you offer less, sometimes if you offer less visual and then unpack it, because then we really have to make sense of it. And furthermore, that will reveal the degree to which the visualization is an abstraction, rather than simply another form of kind of mimetic fetishism. You know what I mean? So anyway, that wasn't concise, but the territory scale thing is really interesting. Stuart also spoke to that. I just want to connect that point to the urban. Same issue, different parallel debate. The urban is often simply viewed as a scale, and I'm guilty. Some of my writings from 20 years ago, and I also 20 years ago referred to the territorial scale in a piece on Lefebvre. I'm embarrassed. I want to give you the site because I don't want you to read it. But I was just trying to work out my own framework, and I fully reject that now. Territory is multiscalar, Stuart Elden. I'm saying the same thing about the urban or urbanization scalar. It's not just local or metropolitan, it's multiscalar. And the book that I have coming out, it's also going to take a while before it finally emerges. I've just been told by OUP, my publisher, May 2019, so whatever, you know. At some point it will appear, but it's called New Urban Spaces, Urban Theory and the Scale Question. And one of the arguments is the urban is multiscalar, and most, perhaps more interestingly, the scalar configuration of urbanization mutates in patterned ways during the geohistory of capitalism. And it's being radically reconfigured in the context of planetary urbanization. That's basically the argument of the book, and then I try to offer some frameworks of analysis for dealing with that. So it's, again, bring together different sociospatial categories. The point about Doreen Massey, really glad that Doreen's work is mentioned and invoked here, and that people are engaging with fundamental methodological theoretical foundation. She, more than anyone else, really pushed and developed and elaborated and mobilized a relational concept of space. Space is not a thing, it's a process, and it's always constituted through relations. And what Doreen Massey did with incredible insight and brilliance is connect the relationality of space to power. And it's easy to say that, but to actually mobilize that proposition in relation to particular issues that we care about is complicated. And Doreen Massey, she elaborated it with incredible eloquence and power. And certainly the ways in which Christian Schmid and I are trying to think the relationship between concentrated, extended, and differential urbanization, it's absolutely building on that methodological foundation. The relational dimensions of space, in this case, applied to the particular power geometries, to use one of Doreen Massey's concepts, the power geometries of urban. So absolutely. And one of the points about that was about the storytelling, and a lot needs to be said about that connects up with presentations. I think the issue here is, again, it goes to the ways in which all of the visualizations are not just mimetic captures of the real, they're always abstractions, they're always meta-theoretical interpretations, putting that into relief. And that's certainly part of what Christian and I and our collaborators are trying to do as well, that a lot of the work we're doing about urbanization, even though it's embedded within different social scientific discourses, it's intended as a form of political criticism. It's intended to put into relief certain aspects of contemporary world capitalism that are rendered invisible and dominated by ideologies. So in that sense, it is a particular form of storytelling, even though we have characterized it with the reflexivity and eloquence that Rania Ghosn earlier did today. The point that I'm going to connect a couple different points that were made. So Lindsay's question about matter and the question about world systems theory, I actually want to connect. So I think this is a really fundamental point, and I'm very sympathetic to it. I didn't begin with this particular orientation. As my work on these matters has evolved, I've become much more sort of foundationally focused on urbanization as metabolism. Of course, people will know there's a vast, sophisticated Marxian literature on the metabolism of urbanization. A lot of it historically is focused on the city, which is productive. I mean, I build on that. But Hilary Angelo and David Wachsmuth, two of my wonderful former doctoral students from NYU, have argued that we really need to push that idea of urban metabolism to think about many geographies, not just the geographies of the city. But one of the questions that Lindsay's point raises is what's being metabolized? What exactly is being metabolized? And I had the privilege last semester of teaching a course with my now former colleague, Keel Mo, formerly of GSD, now at McGill in Montreal, on the energetics of urbanization. And it was like, I got to be Keel Mo, his graduate student for a semester. It was incredible. He's an architectural theorist and historian and sort of data scientist who thinks about energy and architecture. And his argument that would be basically that what's being metabolized is energy. So we start with the sun and the energy design gets converted into kinds of spatial configurations, including material spatial configurations. And he builds on the work of Odom, a very brilliant critical ecologist who talks about not energy, but emergy with an M. And the idea is that all material structures are embodied energy. That's a process in transformation. And if you apply that to urban, which is what we tried to do with our students in the course, you end up with a very matter-centric, but also simultaneously processual concept of urbanization. And it leads towards another articulation to Jason Moore's work, and this is the connection to world systems theory from the earlier question, and in Jason's sense, ecology. Effectively, you end up trying to develop a conceptualization based on the work we did in that seminar of urbanization as a form of metabolic rift. So the very production of urban space involves a kind of transformation of energy into matter. And that involves a kind of particular geography of unequal ecological exchange, which is a big part of what Jason Moore's work is all about. And anyway, that's under development, but those are just some hints of the directions that we want to go. And maybe one final comment, if I may. Stuart's remark about outside territory. I can't end my comments without connecting that up a little bit with the debates on the urban theory without and outside. That's become a topic of quite a lot of polemic and misunderstanding and even nastiness in some of the literature. And it's given me the opportunity to reflect on that formulation. But just a few quick things. One is that the idea of urban theory outside, in a certain way, the argument is not an affirmation of the idea that there's not an outside. Just as Stuart was saying about territory, that's exactly what we need to critique, the degree to which urbanization processes are operational, so dimensions of sociospatial and ecological relations. So the idea of the fact that, or to the degree that urban theory without and outside might be something we need to develop, that's because of an ongoing environmental disaster in the world, rather than a kind of imperialism of the theorist. It's actually precisely what we're trying to criticize. I would like to have a kind of formation of the world in which a different form of urbanization existed, and thus a completely different form of urban theory would be required. But to the degree that an urban theory without and outside might be useful, that's precisely because of the totalizing or imperialist formation of capitalist urbanization that we need to fight against. So a lot more can be said about the idea of without and outside. I'm not trying to argue that every aspect of social life should be subsumed or could be subsumed productively under an urban theory. I think that's not the argument at all. It's simply that to develop an approach to urban theory that illuminates contemporary conditions, the idea of an inside and an outside binarism is not particularly useful. So the geographies are uneven, variegated, incomplete. But nonetheless, the inside-outside sort of cartography is one that increasingly occludes our ability to understand the phenomenon and the process and the contestation that we need to decipher.
Just one thing, and it's not about my work. It's about a fantastic project called the Italian Limes Project, which has got a book coming out, which is called A Moving Border, Alpine Cartographies of Climate Change. And it's a really, really wonderful project where they're looking at high alpine borders that Italy has with some of its neighbours, particularly the Italian-Austrian border, where the boundary line is the watershed line through glacier regions. And because this is now melting, and it's melting so fast because of the product of climate change, the boundary line is becoming difficult to map, and so they're trying to think about how this might be mapped. They're looking at this historically, conceptually, but also through having sensors up on the glacier and working out where the border is. And the Italian Parliament passed a confine mobile, a moving border, that the border within some limits could fluctuate in relation to this geophysical process. And so talking to the people that are running this project and thinking with them on some of these ideas, it's this material comes in, and where this idea of the fixity of borders around territories is something that I think is having to be re-questioned and rethought. So.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, sadly, we need to conclude. We're going to just shut the room and the cameras, but thank you very much, everyone. All the speakers. It's been a long day, but very fruitful. Probably have coming out with more questions than answers, but I think part of it was the objective, and also I hope that these all presentations at least serve to introduce the work of certain people like Neil or Rania that hasn't been here before, and I think it's also necessary to incorporate their thinking and to question as well what they've been doing. So thank you very much, everyone.